Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to A Difference in Thought. You are tuned into the one and the only A Difference in Thought, Season 2. Now, before we get into the regular spiel, for those that listen, you know what I'm about to do. But just want to let you know, it's a visual podcast now. So you're saying, man, how you been away for so long? It's been so long. What have you been doing? Well, first of all, if it's your first time listening or now watching, A Difference in Thought engages and processes recent events, culture, philosophy, public policy, and faith through the ancient art of truth telling. Join the conversation and gain an alternative perspective with A Difference in Thought. This podcast is an honor and a homage of the work and mission of the great Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. right up above me. The philosophy of the podcast is basic arithmetic teaches us that there can be no difference without subtraction. Before first wondering where you'd like to see a difference, first consider where you'd like to see a subtraction. We also live on Apple Podcasts, Google Play Podcasts, and SoundCloud. So ladies and gentlemen all over the world, welcome to the one and the only A Difference in Thought. I'm your host, Charlie Ray. If this is your first time watching or listening, now I know y'all been saying, God dang it, where you been? It's been a long time. I know. I've been trying to get this together for you all. You know, you see, we've got a set here. We've got so many interesting things and places that I've been. So, I mean, truth be told, I mean, I've been traveling for real. Like, it's thanks to my job, I've been able to do a lot of the work that I do that you all hear in your ear holes. It's not just happening in between your ears, it's happening outside of them in the world. So I've been able to recently just have discussions, preaching sermons, and screening movies, and so it's all been a similar theme. So we'll tell you all about that. But so welcome to the YouTube channel. So before we get started, go ahead and subscribe. We're gonna have content for this. We're gonna have interviews, events, all sorts of things. This is gonna be the hub of what we're doing in this faith-rooted revolution that we are trying to build. So thank you all for listening. So in all of my comings and goings, I have noticed a trend, and you know, this is Thanksgiving weekend, and it's interesting that due to the history of our country and the true nature of the relationships with Native Americans, it's interesting that this seems to be the National Day of Misremembering, or shall we say disremembering, and the way that we look back on it is just the testament of the American heritage and history has meant different things for different types of people. If you want to get specific, if you talk about the white experience in America and the non-white experience in America has been quite different. You can listen to 2 episodes ago, we talked about the souls of white folk and really what the nature of that has been. But even like continuing through this theme, and even in some of the beginning episodes, we talked about the most loving thing you can do be for a person is a truth teller. Is to hold a mirror to someone and say, examine yourself in light of what this truth is saying. I was actually preaching a sermon. One of my friends, shout out to the homie OJ, this state youth convention was coming together, and they pulled these young African Americans and said, hey, what do you kind of want to talk about? And so the issues that they came up with was that they wanted to talk about the black experience in America, and they wanted to talk about Jesus and how he kind of fits within this within that just kind of matrix of issues there. And so I came and I talked to them. It was an issue that it was talking about, you were already clean. And it talks about how Jesus, when he was young, was presented to a guy named Simeon, and Simeon said he would be a light and he'd be a blessing. But as Jesus went throughout his life, you have people like Philip going to say, "Hey, Nathaniel, we found him. We found the Messiah," right? He comes in and Nathaniel's like, "Fam, what good can come from Nazareth? You don't get out of here with that," right? Or the Pharisees calling him the devil, all these other types of things. So he was familiar with coming through a system where he was poor, and he was under the boot of the Roman Empire, and so many people had negative things to say about him, but he believed to speak the words spoken over him than the words spoken against us. And there are so many, and going back into the original context of America, we kind of are this testament against America. And so another thing that I shared in that sermon that I think is helpful for this conversation here is a story with John the Baptist. And now, if you listen to the podcast, we talked about him earlier and talking about the problem with nationalism and bearing fruits worthy of repentance. But here, John the Baptist finds himself in prison. Now, how did he get in prison? He testifies to this king and says, "Yo, it's not right for you to have your brother's wife." His brother's wife ain't really feeling that. So then she begins to hate John the Baptist. The king respects him and is like, "Yo, I ain't finna kill this man. This is obviously a man of God, right?" But, the wife just isn't feeling him. And so she asks on her birthday, when the king's like, "Yo, you have anything you want?" She's like, "Yo, I want the head of John the Baptist." And so now here's the thing about, like, yo, why does she hate him so much? And so here's the thing with John the Baptist. She didn't hate him because, of his weird hairstyle or anything like that, right? Or honey locusts, all these other weird things he dabbled in. She hated him because the truth he presented challenged her and made her reconsider the lie that she was holding on to about herself and her relationship with others. So I say that to say, and what I told these young people is saying that sometimes America will hate you or push up against you, not because of just who you are, but that your very presence as African Americans, we are the physical embodiment of the truth that challenges what America tells itself, right? And so we can get into season 2, episode 1. This is America, truth-telling in the age of distorted nostalgia. Now, when you see a lot of the horrors that happen, so when you talk about the pipe bombing, the Tree of Life synagogue shooting, the man that was trying to shoot up a black church, but then ran into a Kroger and shot 2 black people and said, whites don't kill whites. In this type of nature, you always will see people saying things like, "This is not America. This is not the way that it should be," or, "This is not us," and different things like that. But really, the African American experience, the Native American experience, the Japanese American experience, right? The Latinx American experience is saying, "Oh, wait a minute now. The way that you're looking back and reflecting on that is in contrast to the reality I've lived in this country." And so now the statement is not, "This is not America." And if you say I want America to be something different than this, because the truth is, outside of this distorted nostalgia, this has been what America has been for quite some time. And perhaps the reason why people hate African Americans and the Native American experience and choose on Thanksgiving to disremember what happened with things like the Pequot War and the Trail of Tears and all these other types of things, right? Is because we, just like the person who hated John the Baptist, they want to hold on to a lie that paints them in a better light instead of looking at the truth that incriminates them. Now, as I've been saying throughout this series, you have to learn the truth. We have to learn to love the truth that incriminates us, because it is that truth that sets us free to be something other than the villain. Dr. King talked about this in his sermon Guidelines for a Constructive Church, where he talks about, Jesus came to set the captives free. And the captives in this racism thing aren't just the people who are having dogs thrown on them or the people who are being lynched and being assaulted, though that is very real. It's also people sitting in church pews that are captive to racism. And because if preachers are captive to fear and don't talk about it, we got to if we're going to be a constructive church in this society, in this American society, we have to speak that truth and set those captives free. Dr. King also said that we are the conscience of the nation. When in a nation that wishes to say to forget the past and forget the sins that they have done, we are that conscience. We are that living embodiment of a truth that people with distorted nostalgia don't want to hear. That is the same distorted nostalgia that says, make America great again. It's the same distorted nostalgia that says, let's talk about Northern aggression during the Civil War, while ignoring the Southern aggression and the terrorism that was the Confederate, that was the Confederacy, and that was the Ku Klux Klan, and that was the Jim Crow South. And so one of the other things that I was able to do is I was able to venture on a bus trip, like a 12-hour bus trip with a bunch of other black, beautiful people. Shout out to the Black Behind field trip. They didn't say behind, but I'm going to say behind here. Fill in the gaps, y'all. We got to venture down to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice by the good brother Brian Stevenson. And what it is a living embodiment of truth that talks about the history of America with lynching. And so a lot of the lynching sometimes was politically motivated. Sometimes it was just as little much as someone whistled at a white woman, or someone just found someone to be annoying. And so when we talk about truth-telling age of distorted nostalgia, these are the types of narratives that typically are left out. James Baldwin talks about this in his letter to his nephew, that talks about you'll see these violences happening against your people and see that you are asked to forget about them. And we talked about this in our episode, Whose Past Matters, right? Where the African American is often, and the Native American is often told, forget about it, while everyone else is told never forget. And the reason we're talking about that is that we're not just saying this to get our narrative told, though it's very important. We also want to see captives set free. If America's going to be something different, nostalgia isn't the way that is going to be happening, right? I love Thurgood Marshall, and he talked about at the bicentennial of the signing of the Constitution, and other people saying this is the greatest man-made document. All this thing. Thurgood Marshall said, "Hey, look, brother, it's an all-right document until we fought and did what we had to do to actually make it be real to other people." And so when you're so much caught up in this distorted nostalgia, you can't really capture the true foe and original sin that America still faces. And so we're going to go into a segment now called A Difference in Resistance. And it's going to be called Honor as Resistance. I'm going to take you to what I saw at the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. It's going to impact you when I have you weigh. This is A Difference in Thought. Check out A Difference in Resistance. Honor as Resistance. I recently ventured to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice on Veterans Day with a group of African Americans to honor who our veterans have been in the war that has been the racial caste system of America. It was haunting, but also strangely helpful to see monuments used in a way to honor the people that should be honored. But it was like walking through a graveyard, and just to see the magnitude of terror. Now, for those who don't know, each of these represent a county where a lynching happened. And it's not just one name per board, though. Imagine how massive that would be. Some of these have 2 names, some of them have up to 20. Understand the magnitude of how common and how vast the white domestic terrorism was in America. And to think that just this year in the history of America is where we finally took off the distorted nostalgia and said, we're going to create a landmark. to honor these people. It was interesting walking through these monuments, and while seeing young African American men who often were the victims of those crimes and still of police killings today, it was haunting as they start on the level ground, but then they slowly begin raising towards the ceiling, as the excruciating process of lynching often was. As you just walk through it, there's a feeling of both terror and respect that's hard to capture on video. Seeing that these lives that I see today back then were seen even in this massacre where 229 people were killed, a lot of them all on the same day, yet this is the first day that I heard about it. And so misremembering and disremembering often cast aside the stories of these fallen soldiers. A war they did not sign up for, but they just apparently had the audacity to want their humanity considered and respected. Some people being lynched for things as much as not returning a shovel, and apparently that was worth their life. It is hard to take in, but it is also important. It's important that we recognize that the veterans for peace and justice didn't all die overseas, but some died right here in a homeland that was not secure, fighting a cause that their government supported or turned a blind eye to. Or even worse, erected monuments that celebrated and symbolized the mindset of the perpetrators of these crimes to remind the victims of the type of system they were living under. It's important that we remember them as they are and not through the lens of distorted nostalgia. It's important that we recognize that this process didn't end, it simply evolved. And just like there are those in the past whose stories we don't know, there are people today, black security guards and police officers, doing their job or even stopping mass killings, but killed as if they were the perpetrator. Here we see two young black boys reading something that was illegal during slavery and something that could have ended them up in one of the tombs that they now observe. And we still face today a education system that lynches the future of black minds. What are we going to do in the face of that? Or a system that views some of these children as a threat, as automatically suspicious? How often do we lynch their dignity? How often when they are approached by the government are they met with the same suspicion and violence? We must not forget them. We must say their names and not let them be lost in distorted nostalgia. So heavy. I mean, how y'all feeling after that? It's really hard. I mean, just to imagine that these just the magnitude of it in one place really makes you look into the reality of the past of America, and even how that has passed through generationally. I mean, Brian Stevenson does a great job of also looking at the Legacy Museum, where it tracks from slavery to least convict system to mass incarceration to Jim Crow, and right in the mass incarceration. It really helps you to really look into the mirror of America and seeing how commonplace such terrorism was. And though people may not have had their bodies lynched, having their dignity lynched under Jim Crow, and how terrible that was. And one thing that I meant to say earlier is that when I was preaching this sermon about "You Are Already Clean," it talks about how we talked about the second baptism, saying that you don't have to be baptized into whiteness because of the design God has given you. It's already good. It's already clean. And so I preached the sermon to a room of African Americans, and I had an older lady come up who just in tears was talking about how just living through the embarrassment of Jim Crow is something that just she had to pray through and really just receive healing from. I talked to a guy who was born in the 1930s, and it's him saying, man, I could have used that sermon 40 years ago, and talking about all the jobs that he got turned down for, and just out of racism, and just the hurdles that he faced, and him saying, I knew they were wrong about me, and feeling that being from them. Then I met someone who was born in the 60s, and her saying, how long is a boy going to be a boy? At what point does a boy become a man? And talking about her experience of this through America. Then I met a young lady there who came up in tears and saying that yes, like the images of like white being the standard of beauty have wrecked my soul so much, and just her really wanting healing from that. And I got to go to a screening called The Hate You Give that one of my coworkers put on, and what was powerful to me is that you saw the same generational testament of what America has meant. You saw a young lady there, a teenager in high school, saying, you know, the gun violence and how she could just relate to everything in the movie, from the gun violence, the police brutality, to the low expectations, and just the pressure that she felt. And then her grandmother stood up and said, I feel so hurt that my granddaughter is going through the same things that I went through. Then we had a young lady who stood up and said, you know what, I've been feeling this pressure too, and I'm a teacher, and I've been feeling this, and sometimes when I look in the back seat at my African American son, I say, have I done something wrong by bringing this child into this world that hates him just for the skin that he is in? And seeing America's reaction to the living embodiment of the truth against it, and the terrorism that has happened, that has occurred, that, you know, has not given any answer to. We talked about this when we talk about the divisive origins of whiteness, how we talk about the caste system of America, and how it talks about how when a black person or a person of color commits a crime, how there'll be laws and new branches of government and all these things to remedy it. But what has been the answer to white domestic terrorism that we see? The fact that the president had to be dragged to make a statement against what happened in Charlottesville, or even with these pipe bombings, and the person, and there's this connection between this distorted nostalgia and this violence. W.B. Du Bois talked about that in The Souls of White Folk, where he was talking about the process of how racism corrupts the soul of the white person. And so in this distorted nostalgia and so even now sometimes people even wish, I wish we were back in the days of Bush and all those other types of things. When you think about the foreign policy of America and what is meant across the world, the Bush presidency is one of those things where you can see this mix of nostalgia with this violence. And I'm just going to show a quick clip. When I was in Dallas, I actually got to go to the Presidential Library for George W. Bush. And the reason I was going there is because during his time, with the terrorism that was going on, when terrorism hit America, for some people feeling like the first time, All right, so a lot of times under his presidency is when terrorism first hit America, like in the mainstream is what people say. When you think about what we saw at the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, and he has a very compelling book called Lynching in America, confronting the legacy of racial terror, and it just talks about the how frequent it is. He has this chart that says African American lynching victims by Southern states 1877 to 1950. Alabama 361, Arkansas 492 people lynched, Florida 311, Georgia 589, Kentucky 168, Louisiana 549, Mississippi 654, Texas 335, and the list goes on. I mean, we're talking about, you all can't see this far back, but it goes from the most active counties in lynching. It just talks about this terrorism that happened far before the Bush presidency, and you'll see in the video here how Bush, as soon as the terrorism happened, he starts Department of Homeland Security, but this homeland has not been secure for Native Americans, African Americans, way before that. But with this distorted nostalgia, without the truth telling, without the narrative change that needs to be happening, you can also go into nostalgia and start to miss, as we talked about in NIMBY, that the lore of Not in My Backyard is that it demonizes those outside your fence, but it also makes you blind to the very demons that lie right in your home vicinity. And for a while, it has not been an answer to this. And so we're going to take a look at my experience at the Presidential Library for George W. Bush, the good, the bad, the ugly, and the strangely familiar. I was in Dallas and traveling, and I thought, hey, why not visit the George W. Bush Presidential Library? Had some time to kill. And so here is the Presidential Library that chronicles the legacy of George W. Bush. It was Christmas here at the library, so they had all the decorations up. I always find it interesting that during Christmas that tells the story of a different family, a family that was under the pressure of its government, that had to flee oppressive leaders vying to keep their power in place. And as I saw this, another group of leaders vying for power, I often wondered what the life of Jesus would have been like, the center of this holiday, under the types of, I guess, mentalities and things perpetuated in America and even under this presidency. Well, not Lincoln. I like him. Here in the most powerful room in, some would say, in the world, or at least a pretty good replica of it, I was thinking, what was Christmas, or the central figure of Christmas's experience, be like in the USA? Now, Bush was known for someone being a person of faith, and hear him saying that this brown Palestinian savior of the world changed his life forever. Yet his policies changed forever the region of the world that Jesus came from. So here you see, the importance of treating each individual as equal and equally important. And that being the legacy that runs through the museum. This American story, true for some and yet to be totally true for others, is some of this striving that is seen. Yet, some things 18 years ago seem very true today as you look at the recount we just had in Florida. This charge to keep still doesn't seem fully kept. As you see this No Child Left Behind in education reform, it's still something that we face today, and some say maybe even took a focus on SOLs. And here we see this doctrine of security in the face of terrorism. And as getting fresh from Alabama, I often wondered, where was the homeland security for the people that were lynched? Where is the homeland security who do not fit into the stereotypical mold of American and the stereotypical mold of terrorism, as we've seen pipe bombs and shootings? Who's defending the homeland for them? That is a question that surged through my mind. Human choices do indeed move events, but what we choose to honor and who we choose to honor versus who we choose to ignore. There was no branch of government built for those who suffered white domestic terrorism. What was freedom for them then? And do we have freedom today? Liberty is indeed the right and hope of all humanity. But do some people get lost in the all? Is it not quite specific enough for them yet? Are they free to correct the narrative of nostalgia? Or are they forgotten in it? Having the moral courage to look into the truth of America is a charge we all have to keep. All right, and so there you have it. And so, again, you don't react to something that you ignore. Or maybe ignoring actually is the reaction. So we talk about misremembering, we talk about disremembering. And so, again, you saw the reaction that a person got to terrorism. So if you're wondering, like, how would America respond to terrorism today? Or even a legacy of terrorism, I want to bring you to this section that you all know and love. It's called Do Better Baby. Now, today's Do Better Baby recipient is none other than Mississippi candidate for Congress, Hyde Smith, right? So, Mrs. Hyde Smith here, she is in Mississippi. Now, Mississippi was the deadliest. And if you saw in the video there, you could see that when some slates were empty, Mississippi often was full of names of lynch victims and being some of the deadliest places to live in their history of lynching. Now, she got an endorsement from someone, and she, in this video, which I'm sure you guys have seen, she says, well, if this person invited me to a public hanging, I'd want a front row seat. Now, Mississippi, known for its domestic terrorism, and the chief offender in states with the most amount of lynching, where again, out of the 4,084 victims, Mississippi was number one with 654. Okay, lynchings. All throughout all different counties: LaFleur, Carroll, Kemper, Hinds, Lonesville, Yazoo, Lauderdale. Any of the counties, all of them pretty much have a legacy of this. For her to make light and say that she would want to attend a public hanging and that she would want a front row seat, and she is running against an African American, Mike Espy, right now. They're gonna have a runoff election in a couple of days. I think it's on Monday or Tuesday. Very real. And then when she was confronted with this, she said, well, if anyone was offended, that's not what I meant. She said what she said, and if you felt offended, I'm sorry you felt offended, but I said what I said. And so then in a press conference, he's with another, I believe I think it's the governor that's there, then the media saying, hey, well, in light of Mississippi's history of pretty much terrorism against black people, do you change your statement? She said, I made a statement and said what was said. But here's what the thing. She's standing in front of the Mississippi flag, which has the Confederate symbol right on it. And so here she has this distorted nostalgia. She takes pictures with a gun and a Confederate hat. Then the governor says, well, I don't hear people talking about abortion and all these other types of things, and deflecting these types of things. And here she is on the cusp of staying in a seat of power, saying these things, the same types of things that, the racist robocalls that DeSantis ran, and she's getting donations from white supremacists. And so I gotta say, do better, baby. If you want to be a leader of a community, you've got to know the devils of that community that you have encountered in the past, and you have to have the courage, the moral courage, to be a truth teller. And because of her lack of wanting to do that, Hyde-Smith, you get the do better, baby. And so, and now some of you may say, well, dang, well, it's sometimes with things like that, it's very easy to say, obviously we're missing the mark. But it's a very interesting line that Brian Stevenson runs from the National Memorial of Peace and Justice to the Legacy Museum that talks about how we too, who are blind to what's happening with the death penalty and mass incarceration, we may be, as Dr. King warned, sleeping through a revolution. Where we are, due to being sedated by success that Thurgood Marshall talks about, or saying we're not as bad as we used to be, we still can have this also distorted nostalgia that ignores the present suffering, the present connections to what we have been seeing here in America. And so I had the privilege to interview a man by the name of Gary Randle when I was in Fort Worth, Texas. And he's a very interesting individual in all of this because Mr. Randle, his family actually fled the domestic terrorism in Oklahoma back in the days of lynching. His parents did, and so they fled. He grew up, growing up in Texas, decided to enter law enforcement. Because of him seeing how connected the law enforcement was with lynching. He wanted to make a change there. And so he's on the force for years, and then it's when he suddenly decides to have an encounter with mass incarceration as a police officer, actually visiting a prison. It's interesting to see how this changed the trajectory of his life. And he's a good example of, instead of relying on distorted nostalgia, what transformation we can have when we actually embrace the truth, even the truth that incriminates us. This is a segment we're going to call A Difference in Conversation with Gary Randle. Stay tuned. Hello, I'm here with A Difference in Thought here in Fort Worth, Texas, with Mr. Gary Randle here. And as you know, the episode name is This is America, Truth-Telling in the Age of Nostalgia. Now, in recent events, we have seen pipe bombers sending bombs in the mail to black senators. We had the unfortunate incident of the shooting for a Tree of Life synagogue. And then in Kentucky, we had a white man come and who attempted to shoot the church, actually, but because it was locked, he went to a Kroger and killed 2 African Americans there. And as the news goes on, and I'm sure you've probably seen this before too, that a lot of times the narrative that kind of goes is this is not America, as if this somehow is a blip in the system of how America has been, as if this has been the exception instead of the rule. But a lot of times, as far as you know, the narrative of America's actual history of violence actually is not new, and it actually is violence is actually quite American in its origins. For those who listen to the podcast, and I was telling you about this book earlier, it's called The Irony of American History by Reinhold Niebuhr. And for those who don't know him, he actually wrote The Prayer of Serendipity. For those who know hip hop, Eminem says it in the beginning of one of his songs very famously. But Reinhold Niebuhr says that actually America has always been quite violent, and it hasn't been that different than any other country that pretty much cleared out different people. And so when you think about Native Americans, right, exactly, right. It's pretty much the ethnic cleansing that kind of came back there, and the violent assimilation that took place as well. And then you look at slavery and the history of lynching. And I, as you'll see later on in the podcast, actually on Saturday ventured to Alabama on like a 12-hour bus trip to go to Bryan Stevenson's National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which does a good job of honoring the people that went through lynching and terrorism, domestic terrorism at the hands of the South after the Civil War. And a lot of times part of the lost cause that Confederates did was changing the textbooks that changed this narrative that didn't talk about the evil of America's original sin and became more about Northern aggression or about the economy. But at what point do people get to talk about Southern aggression, right? Yes. Against that. And I remember you were talking about that. That was something that your family experienced in Oklahoma. And if you would tell us about that. And also, go ahead and introduce yourself. Okay. This is Mr. Gary Randle.
My name is Gary Randle.
Right.
And I am the co-founder of Hope Farm. And Hope Farm is a ministry that works with inner city boys who don't have their fathers in their life. And we teach those boys how to be men. We started with them at the age of 5. And so that was a call of God in my life. And so now I'm retired and I'm transitioning, and so we're just seeing what God has for me. And so Alan sat down and talked to us, and we talked about the oppression of Jim Crow. Jim Crow was more intense than slavery because Jim Crow assaulted, black people just for the sake of them being black. And so, there was nothing for a black man to get lynched. Several things that could cause him to get lynched for looking at a white woman. Or saying something to a white woman that was deemed as flirtatious. And that was an offense to get hanged. And the law enforcement would arrest you, but what they would do is just hold you until the mob came and hung you.
Wow.
And so it was a participatory environment. And so one of the things that my parents had to do is they had to leave Oklahoma and Texas to get away from Jim Crow and get away from the violence that associated itself with that mentality of black but unequal. And they took down vengeance on black people, just arbitrarily just hung people who said something that they didn't like.
Yeah, and that's part of the, as they call it, the Great Migration, right? And the history of that, and an interesting through line you were talking about that. Now I knew that a lot of times that police. I think at the exhibit it said about only 1% of lynchings actually were investigated and prosecuted. But I wasn't familiar with how complicit police systems were in lynching. And I know that a lot of times the current killings today, like for example, the example of Mike Brown when he was killed by Officer Darren Wilson, and even the fact that Darren Wilson was in Ferguson because his prior police department, Jennings Police Department, was shut down because of just civil rights abuses and police brutality. And so this through line of lynching with police brutality. Some try and say that that's an exaggeration, but as you said, that it's not as
it's not because a lot of officers come to these major cities and they live in the surrounding cities and they want to come in and they want to work where the action is, and where the action is usually the African American community. So they come in and they're not police officers, they become cops. They become want to control people's life, and if you step out of line, then they will take full advantage of you, and they will violate your civil rights. And in the tragedy in law enforcement, being a black officer in a white department is very, very difficult, because the reality, there is a blue code. And if you step outside the blue code, you become ostracized in your environment, then you become ostracized in your home environment. So it's really tough to exist being African American in a very racist department.
Right. And for our listeners that don't know, and so you actually...
I was a police officer for 15 years.
All right. So tell us more about that experience when you were signing for that. Because I always notice, and there was... actually, this weekend, a security officer was actually shot by police. A black security officer who actually stopped the shooting was then shot by police. And a lot of times, actually in Baltimore, there was a person that was a black officer that was murdered by the name of Sean Suter a couple days before he was supposed to testify against his police department. And so there's this Blue Lives Matter group, and then there's the Black Lives Matter group. But if you're black and you take off the blue,
then you're black.
Right. So tell us more about your experiences.
One of the things that happened, when I was a police officer, one of the things that was taught to us that your weapon becomes your last line of defense. Once you pull your weapon, then you have no other alternatives.
Wow.
But what happens in the minority community, you have white officers who come in with a Rambo, gung-ho, fix them right, make America great. And they use the weapon as their first line of defense. And once you pull your weapon, you don't have any options. You either use it or you put it back in your holster.
Right.
And so that negates the force that you want to exhibit.
Right.
And so, and so we were taught that your weapon is your last line of defense, and it was drummed into us in the academy, but it wasn't accepted by a lot of white officers who came through the academy, because they came in the academy with a fixed ideal, is that they were going to set the minority community straight. They were going to enforce the law. And enforcing the law, they violated people's rights. And when as an African American officer, you observe them violating people's rights, so you're in a quandary.
Right.
Do you pimp on your police officer cohort, or do you just shut up? And so one of the things that I think was important to me, and the officers who worked with me knew my posture. My posture was to treat people like you wanted to be treated.
Right.
It didn't matter what race you were.
Right.
That was my posture in dealing with you.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and it's important to know the perspective that people bring to because there's the conditions of police brutality, but there's also the conditioning of fear of saying just black presence somehow being illegal or suspicious, right? And so if people carry that feeling of being threatened because they've been conditioned by a racist society, right? And so during your time, was there ever any type of bias train, or even just saying like the way you've been conditioned to think might not be correct or even useful when you go into these neighborhoods?
Well, some of the things that I observed as an officer, I observed them violating people's rights, and that wouldn't be done in the majority community. It was done in the minority community, and it's just the way that they treated people, and even the arrest of a person. Sometimes people would violate the crime. Sometimes people need to be arrested, but there was a certain way that you arrested people.
Right.
When I executed an arrest, I would just tell people you can do it the easy way or you can do it the hard way.
Right.
You choose.
Right.
And most every time, people chose to do it the easy way.
Right.
And so, you know, it has a lot to do with the officer's mentality.
Right.
How he interfaced with people. And like I said, the important thing that you have to do is you have to treat people like you want to be treated.
Right. Yeah, I had a powerful interview with back in Richmond, Officer Carol Adams. She's head of the community care unit, and she actually saw that she just needed to give officers opportunities to get to know people beyond when it's time to get arrested and different things like that. And just even her own story was very powerful, and just admire that what you brought. And so when you were talking about setting people straight and the whole law and order, even war on, and so we were talking a little bit about this yesterday. How I was talking about there has to be a difference between racial reconciliation is cool, right? But also thinking about justice expansion, because white society knows how to be just to its own, right? And we were talking about how the difference between the crack, cocaine, and drug epidemic being known as getting a war on drugs from Nixon, but now it's even in my hotel room last night, I was watching, there was this Malibu Passages, and it looked like a vacation home, and this guy's like, I was addicted for 10 years, but I go to Malibu. And,
I smoke crack, or I shot up heroin,
right?
And they are perceived as victims who get addicted.
Right.
And in their addiction, they need rehab.
Right.
But the rehab for African Americans is called prison.
Yeah.
And there's no such thing as rehab.
Right.
And it's called recidivism. They're geared to come back.
Right. Yeah.
They're geared to come back.
Yeah. I remember we were talking with your wife yesterday, and she told a very powerful story about, and maybe you can expand on it. She was talking about a person who found 4 generations of his father and grandfather in prison, versus white counterparts she knew where the institution where their family met was actually colleges, and so it's a disparity in prison. So let's talk about, so for your inspiration of Hope Farm, talk about how a visit to prison and really understanding that, and as you learn more about the percentage of the population versus who's in there, how that deeply impacted you. And
you know, the thing that just staggered me, I went into the prison with a group from a church, and you know, when I signed up to go into the prison, I signed up and I was a police officer, and I was thinking that someone in prison is going to recognize me. There was going to be some drama on the yard. And I started to call my wife and have her come and pick me up, and I wasn't going to go.
Right.
But God wanted me to stay.
Yeah.
I stayed on the bus, and my mind was flooded with the possibility of conflict, of someone recognizing me. But when I saw the prison, my whiteboard was wiped clean. When I saw the 3 rows of cyclone flints with Constantine wire on the top, and the huge walls and the enormous gates, I went into prison, and I was interfacing with people and just kicking it with them, because there was mainly black people.
Yeah.
I was just kicking with them. It was almost like a family reunion.
Yeah.
And I asked the director, I said, tell me about the penal population.
Yeah.
He looked at me and he didn't flinch. He said that the penal population is 80% African American. I said, what?
Yeah.
He said 80%, 80, and we were just 12% of the population.
Wow.
80%
right.
of the population in prison.
Right.
I knew that there was a dead monkey
Yeah.
on the lion's back.
Yeah.
There was something that wasn't right.
Right.
And when I was in the prison, there was a young guy who befriended me, and he just kind of followed me around. Right. He was 19 years old, and he had a 20-year sentence.
Wow.
So you do the math.
Right. Yeah.
20 years old, 19
Yeah.
in 20 years. So he
39.
comes out at 39.
Wow.
Maybe.
Maybe, right. Yeah.
Maybe. And so when our prison visit for that day was over, we were on the bus, and some guys jumped on the bus, and they said that the ladies had prepared food for us. And I thought food I couldn't even eat. I went back to my hotel room, and I just closed the door, and I just dropped on my knees, and I start crying out to God. And I said, God, I'm available for you to use me. However, where you want to use me. I'll work in the prison. I'll do whatever you want me to do.
Right.
And God made it clear to me that he didn't want me working in the prison.
Right.
He wanted me working, keeping them out the prison.
Right. Yeah.
So that's when we started Hope Farm and start targeting boys who were 5.
Wow. Yeah.
And so we learned that it's easier to prepare than it is to repair.
Right. That's as Frederick Douglass said, it's easier to teach a boy than to correct a man. Right. It's very true. So how long was it that you worked as a police officer before you actually visited a prison? Like
I was a police officer. That was probably maybe my 10th year. I was a police officer for 15.
Wow.
And like my 10th year in law enforcement, we got the challenge at church, and the guy came to church, and he challenged the men in church.
Yeah.
And after he made his challenge for the men to come into the prison, all the brothers, I go to an African American church, all the brothers were sitting around like, shoot, I ain't going to no prison. I've been spending all my life trying to stay out of prison.
Right, yeah.
And I felt compelled
to
go.
Yeah, that's a lot of times Jesus asks us to do things for our behalf. Like when he talks about in Matthew 25, I was in prison and you visited me. I think there is something that happens to your spirit when you see injustice, right? So was that common for police officers not to go to prison?
Oh, absolutely. Like I said, that the thought that came up in my mind that someone would recognize me as a cop.
I got you.
And so I would be a policeman in a yard with guys who are in there because of police.
But that fear, though, you're very valid, like, hey, something might happen, but how do you think it would change the mentality of police officers if they went more often?
I think what they would do is stop arresting statistics and recognize that these are people that have value, people who can become productive members of society. One of the things that is so devastating is once a guy goes into prison, he gets a felony. And once you get a felony, you can't do anything. You become permanently underclass. The same thing. That's Jim Crow all over again. And the system is designed to cause you to come back. And I was having lunch with a guy that I know, and he worked for a organization, and he worked for the holdings of that organization. And he told me that the principal entity didn't make any money. And I looked at him and said, well, they're not making any money? And he said, no. And I asked him, I said, well, where are they making their money? He said they're making their money with prison commissaries. Because if you go into prison, if you want something, then you gotta afford it. A piece of pizza, a pizza is like $300.
Lord.
A cigarette, it's $5.
Wow, for one.
It's you know what? there's no rules.
Right. Yeah.
There's no competition.
Right. Yeah.
If you want it, you pay for it. And what people do is they put money on their loved ones' books, and they know that they got money, and they get that money.
Wow. So somebody could approve money going through to somebody's books, and they could go to that person and sell them something for any type of crazy price.
You name it.
Wow. And so it's still that American principle that there's nothing more divine than profit, right?
Money is their God.
Right. W.E.B. Du Bois talks about this, and he talks about it's in his essay called "The Souls of White Folk," and he talks about that the disdain for black people, the abuse of black people, continues in America as long as it profits, right? And that whole for the reason why the love of money being the root of all sorts of evil is still very much the cause of that violence that we see today. Absolutely. So now W.E.B. Du Bois also said that in light of all of my learning, right, and discovering and doing my research and all the awareness that what am I going to do? So let's talk some more about so your transition from that night where you're crying out and saying, what am I to do? And then Hope Farm. So tell us more about Hope Farm.
Well, Hope Farm is a program that started to impact the lives of inner city children. But when we first started it, we thought that we would take kids from the Child Protective Service system and raise them in a rural environment. But the heavens were made on iron. Nothing happened. But when we changed the location but remained the same vision, we moved to the inner city, and it was a cloudburst. Yeah. And then we started by acquiring a crack house, and we turned the crack house into a after school program. Wow. An after school program for single parent boys who are being raised by a single mom. Right. And there's millions and millions of them. And so what we did was we started mentoring those boys and holding those boys accountable, and giving the boys structure, because every kid wants to be able to fill the walls. They want to be able to fill the walls, and so we gave them structure. We gave them accountability folders that the teachers signed off for their behavior, and it was just amazing how their life changed. And I had boys who started with me at 5 that are now grown men. Wow. 25 and 26 years old. Men who are pastors, men who are God's using them to change their life. But the important thing about Hope Farm is we did this, but we were reaching out to these boys, but we wanted to impact these boys spiritually. I had a dream, or I had a vision. I don't know exactly what it is, but I was standing and the boys were descending, passing me, and they got right in my face. And they said, how come you didn't tell me about Jesus? I said, whoa, I woke up from that, and I said, that's never going to happen. Because there's a lot of things you can recover from. You can recover from being fatherless. You can recover from being homeless. You can even recover from being a drug addict. But there's no recovery from dying without having Christ in your life. Hell has no exits. So that was primary. And the peripheral thing was develop them as a complete man, addressing spirit, mind, and body.
So tell me about also, you were telling me yesterday about the transition of where you were impacting boys holistically, but then you were thinking holistically more about the family as well when your daughter came alongside. Tell me what happened with that vision.
My daughter came and she worked for me, and she came into my office and she says, Dad, you don't know anything about these mothers. And I looked at her and I said, you're right. Because, I'm married to one that I don't know anything about. I'm married to one who that I love dearly, but it just changes. Stuff changed, you know, and women changed the rules of the game.
Right.
And when you got one rule down, then the rules are changed. You're like, oh. Am I to do this or am I not to do this?
Right.
And so she says, Dad, you don't understand these women. And what you don't understand is this, that all these women who are here have experienced negative treatment by the hands of a man. Some of them have been sexually abused, some of them have been physically abused, some of them have been raped, some of them have, experienced incest.
Right.
And it's all at the hand of a man. And you're telling them to trust you?
Right.
They don't trust you. So what she did, she wrote a program, and the program was where she wrote a program for the moms to how to help make them whole.
Right.
And in the program, it was a job description for a mom's resource coordinator who was a single mom who had raised their children and who were responsive to the issues of womanhood.
Yeah.
So what we learned to do was to impact not just the boy, but to impact the whole environment.
Right. Yeah.
And what we use to impact that whole environment was the gospel.
Yeah.
Because in Ezekiel 26:36, he talks about, I will take out your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh.
Right.
We're interested in heart surgery.
Right.
We can't do it, but Christ can.
Right. Yeah, I'm a firm believer that all revolution is first internal, right? Personal transformation, and that is the power of the Holy Spirit, the Paraclete that comes alongside us and helps us to generate a new process. So I remember a story that you guys were talking about yesterday, where you were talking to one of the mothers, and you had asked them, and I think she was hesitant on whether to let her son be involved, and you were saying, would you let another woman date your son? Right?
Yeah. One of the things that the moms would come in and they would try to get their sons in the program. Right. And they would come and they would have their quote Sunday shoes on. They had their best behavior and they were very prim and proper and, talking about their sons. And I would let them talk to a certain point. And then I would stop them. I said, ma'am, in light of what you told me about your son, would you marry him? Right. And they would look at me, not one mom. In all the years I've done this for 25. Not one mom was able to say, yes, I would marry my son. Right. Because they knew that they had some issues that needed to be developed. Right. And they needed to be brought into manhood. They needed to be taught how to be a man. And when I go out and I speak to people and I talk to groups and I tell them this illustration, I said, have you ever put together a Revell model car? And they would raise their hand and say, yes. I said, well, you please tell me what is the most important part of in that package. Right. Some people said the glue. Some people say the pieces. Some people would even say the instruction. And I would tell them, I said, yes, those things are important, but they're not the most important. The most important piece in that package is the picture on the box. Wow. Right. Because it shows you how to complete this model correctly. It shows you what it's supposed to look like. Right. And so what we were able to do for these young boys is to be the picture on the box. Wow. That's powerful right there. So just imagining and for the listeners that want to get engaged, understanding that, and like you said, the stigma that we place on people, right? The stigma we place on prison, and that as you move closer and as you move closer, and Jesus always
marched toward the people that were on the margins. The Samaritan woman at the well who said, "Oh, you can't worship because you're Samaritan," or touching the lepers and finding value in those people. Saying that a lot of the people that we discount, right, and even the scriptures say, "Without vision, people perish," right. That it could be that these people have all the pieces that that we have, except the only difference is what image they've had. That's very powerful, and even just as African American men, that like we can't let the first time that people are surrounded in the multitudes of men be in a situation like prison, right? So the images are very important. So one thing that I like to talk about on my podcast and for listeners is talking about the importance of unity and collaboration with other people, and how God doesn't call us to do things within silos. So though God may speak to us initially, He always adds people into our stream of revolution that we're having. So tell me about the people that you collaborated with and that were sent to come alongside you to help push that vision towards, and why it's important to collaborate in any work that God gives you. Yeah.
In a relationship, you're always going to have two sides. My mother used to tell me, she said, "Son, it's a poor pancake that ain't flat on both sides." and so, you have one side,
right,
and you see certain things, but there's a side of you that don't see. You have a blind side.
Right.
So the first and the most important person who God sent to collaborate with me is my wife. My wife had my blind spots. And then gave me a partner who was opposite of me. He was a cross the T and dot the I person. I was the visionary.
Right. Yeah.
And then brought me a administrative assistant that is so diligent. There's not a thing that could be bought without bringing her a receipt.
Right.
She was just very, very, very exact.
Right.
And and brought people alongside who understand that in order to move this issue, it had to be pushed. It wasn't going to move by itself.
Right.
And so people came along with skills and resources and money to cause this thing to occur. And one of the things that was instrumental, that I was a firm believer, and I had a man who mentored me that believed in not taking any money from the government because of the strings that were attached. So this was all done by individuals and foundations, and Hope Farm was cash and carry. That everything that at the farm was paid for. And I say this, and I want to say this to your audience, that money never has and money never will be an issue with God. God's got plenty money.
Right.
Plenty of money. But what you got to do is line your life up with His. Your will has to become His will.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And then you connect to all the resources that He has.
That's right, because God finances His will. Right.
He ain't gonna finance yours. Finance His.
Right.
One of the things that I did in the Fort Worth Police Department, I was asked to become an instructor.
Right.
And I was asked to teach cultural diversity.
Oh wow.
In a very, very racist department.
Oh, you gotta tell us about that.
I taught cultural diversity.
Right.
And the foundation that I used was John 4. Jesus at the well. Jesus would not let his culture supersede his commitment to him, to Christ.
Right.
Culture must always take second place. Right. I'm not a black Christian. I'm a Christian.
Right.
I am a Christian who happens to be black.
Right. Yeah.
my Christianity has to take first place because he's not going to take any other place.
Right.
So once I put that first,
Right.
then my culture becomes powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
It becomes powerful.
Right.
I become an instrument that God uses within my culture.
Right. Yeah. And so talking about like culture and Christianity, and there are problems that occur when people try to take their faith to meet out the wills and conditioning of their culture. I think of the story of James and John when they're coming through Samaria. And so Jesus said, hey, if somebody's not down to listen, shake the sandals off, God will handle it. But when they come through Samaria, who they were conditioned to think is less than, they say, oh, hey, they didn't listen. Let's call down fire, right? And Jesus says, you're not familiar with the spirit in which you operate. Because, and this is very much true in America, that a lot of the violence that was enacted upon is because people thought that, well, first of all, they made Jesus white, which isn't true. But they centered and wanted to make their culture supreme, their culture worship, and to make other people in the image of their culture. And when they didn't cooperate, then that's when things became violent.
You know, one of the things that I taught in the class is that it's important that a person put someone else down in order to step up.
Right.
You know, you make someone less so that you become greater.
Right.
And that's wrong.
Yeah.
That's wrong. The way that you become greater is by becoming less.
Right. Yeah.
And you know, you have to put people down in order to step up.
Right.
And so, you know, one of the things I told them, I would take my hand like the end of the course, and I would get a penny.
Yeah.
And I would put it in the middle of my hand and said, racism not only keeps things in, but it keeps things from getting out.
Yeah.
It limits you.
Right.
If you're racist, you're limited.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's true. I mean, Whitney Young talks about this in his book that's out of print called To Be Equal. He talks about the problem with racism is that, especially in the American context, is that if you are raised under white supremacy, right, you're eventually going to find out that the world ain't white, the world is brown. And you're not going to be able to operate in those things. And in Ephesians 4, where it talks about diversity leading to maturity, that it's some and some and some. And so, and as you were saying, like, you're not a black Christian. That's not to say that there's something wrong with being black. No. It's just it's saying that black is part of the tapestry of humanity, but it's not the entire.
Yes.
The entire.
And what I was saying is my faith in Christ must be greater than my faith in my culture.
Right. Yeah. Say that again. Ooh, my faith in Christ must be greater than my faith in my culture.
Yes.
Could we imagine if people who use faith in America, right, to and I always talk about that. Is your culture misleading your theology, or is your theology correcting your culture?
Yes.
Imagine what America would look like if people had more faith.
It would change drastically.
Right. Because a lot of times people will forsake the instruments of their faith, right, because they don't know what it means for their culture, right?
And what people have done as misused and misrepresented scripture to fulfill their self-philosophy about their race.
Right, yeah. And that's like John the Baptist, when the Pharisees and the Sadducees come to him, and John says, don't think because Abraham is your father
Yeah.
that you don't have to repent, right? That you can just take off the lens of self-examination because Abraham being your father talking about their nation and talking about their ethnicity, and so you see that in the book of Galatians where there's this tension between people who are not Jewish, but Jewish people were saying we're putting more faith in their Jewish culture than in
Christ.
In Christ,
Yeah.
and Apostle Paul said that's a cursed thing, right? Because not only is it just cursed for them, it's always a curse for people that they're acting upon, because Gentiles were coming in and saying like, oh man, is the design that I've had less in the image of God than another person? And so the importance of that is very good. And wow, that's amazing that you. So how was that received? The diversity training that you did.
Well, what happened to my class? My class got taken by the state of Texas, and I don't know exactly what they did with it, but people will start teaching it. And the powerful thing about that is that I released it graciously because it was based on John 4.
Yeah.
So it was based on unshakable truth.
Right.
It was based on the true truth.
Right. Yeah.
And I know that the Word of God will not come back to him void without accomplishing what he intended for it to accomplish.
Right. Yeah.
So it was my privilege to release the truth.
Yeah.
And that's what we're doing here today.
Yeah.
We're releasing the truth.
Right.
And we're saying that, you have to understand that people are different, but just because they're different, don't make them wrong.
That's right. I went to a prejudice awareness training, and they had a powerful exercise where it has 3 circles and a square, and the question is, which one of these do not belong? So everybody says, "Oh, the square." It's like, no. Read the question. Which one belong? Just because it's different doesn't mean that it doesn't belong.
Absolutely.
Exactly. And as you were saying, the power of the truth and the problem and the reason why we're talking about truth telling in the age of nostalgia is that if America does not embrace the truth, and I always say on my podcast, we have to learn the truth. We learn to love the truth, even the truth that incriminates us, because it is that truth that empowers us to be something other than the villain.
If truth will release you. Truth is the key that unlocks the door. And if you don't have truth, then you stay incarcerated. You may not be in a federal or a state prison, but you're still incarcerated.
Yeah.
Because you're limited by your thinking. And like I said, the schisms, the racisms, the sexisms,
right?
What they do, they not only keep things out, but they also keep things in.
Yeah, that reminds me of so my podcast is dedicated to Dr. King, and one of his sermons is called Guidelines for a Constructive Church, and he talks about Jesus saying that I came to set the captives free, and he said the problem with that people respond to the civil rights movement. He was saying that they only think that the people in prison are the people who can't eat at certain places or the people who have dogs released on them. But he said there are people sitting in churches captive to racism and the isms, right? Yes. Like you said, locked in that system.
Yes.
And the reason why we want truth telling is not just to have our narrative told, because we want to see the captives set free. And there are captives in America and captives that have been captive generationally, that truth telling is an act of love. Yeah.
And people perpetuate their state by confirming that what they're doing is right.
Yeah.
And the reality is it's wrong.
Right.
And it's wrong to prejudge. It's wrong to discriminate.
Right.
It's wrong to have a mentality of superiority.
Right.
We were all created in His image.
Right. Absolutely. So what as we just pray for you in discerning in the next moment of your life, where do you think is the next venture for you and your family?
Well, one of the things that God showed me when I was in the prison, and I wanted to slow the flow of minorities in the prison. So the way that I thought that it could be done is by stopping people from going in. But one of the things I want to do is I want to be involved in helping empty the prisons by identifying unjust sentences and unjust, incarceration. And I want to be involved in setting the captives free. I want God to use me to be involved in setting the captives free. I don't know how he's going to do it, but one of the things I've learned about God is not concerned about ability. He's concerned about availability. So I'm available.
Amen. And yeah, that's really the truth about, like, you have to be available for this work, and sometimes God just uses who's available. So I thank you for your availability, and as you've been setting the captives free in spiritual and in physical ways as well, we're going to continue to pray, and hopefully we can partner in setting the captives free, whether it be spiritual or otherwise.
I think that what you said is true. You cannot be free physically if you're incarcerated spiritually.
Our revolution is first internal. So setting the captives free. And so one of the philosophy of our podcast is that basic arithmetic teaches us that there can be no difference without subtraction, right? And so when you say I want to make a difference in an area, you have to wonder what needs to be subtracted from my life. And sometimes subtraction has to be the lies that we hold on to about ourselves. And sometimes people hate the truth because it changes the relationship they'll have to have with the lie. John the Baptist is in prison because he goes and says to the king, it's wrong for you to have your brother's wife. And then his wife begins to hate him, not because of who John the Baptist was, but because that the truth he held made them have to change her relationship with the lie that she held. And I think that has been the spiritual nature of the violence against us, is because we are a testament against the myth of the Christian nation, right? And that our very truth makes America have to change the relationship that it has to itself. I always try and leave the listeners with something to read. I remember you telling me about the book Myth of a Christian Nation. Would you want to just share a little bit about that?
One of the things that the Myth of the Christian Nation talks about, how we here in America has made the flag synonymous to the cross. And so what it does, it renders the cross futile. It wants to take the power away from the cross. But one of the things that was clear to me, that my God is not going to be trumped.
Amen. We talked about that on our podcast, episode number 4. Are we America's church or are we God's church? And you have to remember that Jesus was killed by his government, not for it. And Caesar said, "Oh, you're trying to be Caesar." That's why they put King of the Jews and mocked him. And so if we're aligned with Christ, we have to be comfortable with being misaligned with our country.
When in my house.
Right, exactly. When it is when it steps outside of the guidelines that God has for its church. And so that's the truth that we are ordained with carrying in America. And I thank you for joining us for this time, and thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
Any last words you'd like to give to the listeners before? No, he's good. Hey,
thank you. I'm good. Thank you.
So thank you for joining us for A Difference in Thought. Remember, the truth telling is that we're in an age of distorted nostalgia and lies, and we have to be willing to tell the truth, because America, in order to be all that it can be, it needs to change its relationship with the lie it has been carrying. This is your host, Charlie Ray. This is Brother Gary Randle here, and thank you for joining us. Peace. What a powerful interview by Brother Gary Randle. And that was a long one, but I just, I think he was just a great example of what being in a system that a lot of times tries to spin a different narrative about people that are captured or imprisoned, whether that's captive to racism or literally in chains. It's important that we stay awake during the revolution, and nostalgia is one of the best lullabies to lull people to sleep. Whether it's Make America Great Again, you have to ask, when was America great? Who was it great for? And who paid the price tag for it to be great? Daggone it. These are all important things to think about and to consider. And Brother Randle's, it was amazing to me, that it took him 10 years before he actually went and saw a prison. Like, that was crazy to me. You can comment below and let me know what stood out for you all as well. But I think it's very interesting that John the Baptist, while he's in prison, asks Jesus, is he who he says that he is? And Jesus says his response that typically, people say, he's talking to John the Baptist. But in the context of this and what was going on with the king's wife, I kind of was reading, Jesus says, blessed is he who's not offended because of me. Could it be that he also was talking about for people like the king's wife who try to bury the truth, right? Instead of letting the truth speak to them and let them surrender that lie. Could it be that it's best, and there's a blessing for those who prefer nostalgia or reality, that it's best to accept the truth that incriminates you than to continue to live in a lie? As we look at the trends of America and people expecting a blue wave or all these other types of things and all those other things, it's important to recognize that nothing's going to change unless it's confronted. At some point, we have to look at our history and look at the way in our narratives. And, eventually, hopefully, there'll be a day where this Thanksgiving thing is actually about what happened to Native Americans and not this Cowboys versus Redskins and all this other types of things, that these other habits of distorted nostalgia that we dive into, or saying, surely God has blessed America, instead of reading things like The Myth of a Christian Nation, or as Reinhold Niebuhr talks about, the irony of American history, and really looking at the soul of America and seeing not only how have we gotten wrong, well, how the things we ignored simply evolved while we have slept through this revolution. And if anybody has the opportunity, I'd encourage you to go to the National Memorial of Peace and Justice. I'm sure the little clip that I had, it can't even do it justice, and the Legacy Museum, and seeing how this nostalgia seeks to lure us to sleep during this revolution. And we have to be mindful of the momentum that we contribute to a system that still is oppressive, that has been, continues to be, and will be oppressive, unless we say this is America. This, Obama was a blip in the system, not Trump. This is how America has typically gotten down, and we have to embrace that truth and wrestle with it and let it change our name like Jacob wrestled with God. But we have to be about it, and we have to stop this distorted nostalgia, and we have to challenge it. This has been A Difference of Thought, Season 2, Episode number 1. This is America, truth-telling in the age of nostalgia. Thank you for rocking with your boy Charlie Ray. I love you. I love you. That's why I'm here. Peace.